Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Buffington. You will notice that this week I am not joined by Dave Russell, but instead we have a new and improved Dave 2.0, if you will. Sam Nichols is joining us. And Sam, now you're joining us from Wisconsin. I hail from the great state of Texas. Our video producer is out of Georgia. Social media is out of Romania. We'd like to know where you're from. So please, as in the chat, we actually won't have the map usable today, but in the chat, please tell us where you're from. Heck, in fact, if you see other people from where you are, go connect, go have lunch, go talk about backup. All right, we're gonna talk about backup, but really mostly today we're gonna set the table. We're gonna set the landscape for cloud protection trends. Last week, Sam and I published a blog on the Veeam.com blog page looking at adoption trends for infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, just really looking at those hybrid architectures overall. So please make sure to go out to Veeam.com, go look at the blog that Sam and I wrote last week. And so it just makes sense for us to talk today. Sam, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason. Super excited to be here. Being in the public cloud, this is absolutely my favorite piece of research that we issue every single year. I use it pretty much each and every single day. And just want to go back to something that you said earlier, which is you're setting the bar high with like a new and improved Dave. I don't know if I don't even know if that's possible for anyone, let alone me. But thanks for setting the bar high.
Well, if you don't deliver, then our beloved and esteemed colleague Leah is joining us next week to continue this conversation. So you've got two chances to surpass Mr. Russell. All right, so let's look at some data and kind of lay this down. Now, this is actually not out of the Cloud Protection Trends Report. This is actually out of our largest report that we ever do, the Data Protection Trends Report 2022. And let me just remind folks, if you haven't seen this data before, let me kind of walk you through what it is. Every year, Veeam uses third-party analyst firms, research companies, to go out and ask unbiased IT leaders about what they're doing across their IT strategies, mostly around data protection. And then we interleave that data in. Well, one of the big questions we always ask is, of your production servers and infrastructure, what percentage is physical? And you see those responses on the left. What percentage are virtual machines within the data center? Those are in the middle of your screen. And then what percentage of your servers are actually server instances running in a hyperscale cloud or a managed ISP IaaS type environment? You see those on the right-hand side. Now, there's a lot of data here because we've asked this question since 2020, and we also ask every year, what do you think you're going to do in the future? And that's going to give us 2023, we're almost there, 2024 is right behind that, et cetera. So let me just walk you through this. And Sam, then I want to get your opinion as far as all the organizations that you talk to, how this is going to come together. But let's take a close look at that slide for a second, because I'm going to step you through a couple meta shifts along the way. So the first shift is when we look at from 2020 to 2021, this data was captured before and after the first advent of COVID. Right. And so with that, certainly any IT initiative that was based on go get new servers and go in the data center and rack them, that was a non-starter, right, after COVID first started. And so there was certainly a dramatic shift where most IT modernization was going to be embracing cloud because there weren't any other platforms to use. Right. And so you saw that shift from 2020 into 2021. Now, then from that, after that point, that kind of gives us kind of a new baseline as far as what infrastructure, especially hybrid infrastructure, looks like. So then what you see are kind of three basic trends. You see on the physical set of servers that you see on that left-hand side from 2020 to 2024, other than the drop in COVID, it's mostly just a gradual decline. Right. And actually, decline is probably not even the right word. It's really a dilution. We're going to talk about why we think that is in just a few minutes, but it is just a gradual, nice, easy slope down. Virtualization, staying pretty flat, right? 23, 25, 24, 24, plus or minus 1 point, really staying flat. Now, my personal belief is that what you're seeing is that physical is going to virtual and virtual is going to cloud. But there are probably some folks who are just leapfrogging. They're going straight from physical in the data center, jumping straight into cloud hosted infrastructure. But of course, Mr. Nichols, the reason you're here today, is to kind of talk about this massive uplift and embracing of public cloud. And I think for many organizations, it starts because of cloud hosted, or a cloud first as a strategy. And then really again, as the virtual and physical machines in the data center dilute, this just seems like this is where it's going to go in the future. That kind of sets the stage for us. Sam, talk through your lens. What all have you touched within Veeam and in the broader community, and how does this resonate with the journey that you've watched so many customers go through?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first thing to actually hone in on this piece is that significant jump when COVID happened, right? A number of these customers were very worried that they couldn't go into the data center if anything were to happen there, and they're legally not allowed to go in. What were they going to do in order to keep infrastructure up and running? So there was this proactive shift towards cloud-hosted virtual machines. Again, whether that was beginning on a physical or a virtual server, this big drive towards cloud-hosted machines, because all of a sudden it's in someone else's data center. That
Sure.
is their problem, and we can reference things like the shared responsibility models and how, the cloud provider is the one that's responsible for that, but I still have ownership of my data, and I can lean on the availability and durability of the cloud to continue powering my services and just access that remotely. So there was, of course, that big shift when COVID first happened, but we do continue to see cloud being consumed by a number of organizations as they start to execute against their transformative cloud-first strategies, right? So the cloud is now becoming the de facto standard for deploying new applications, workloads, and services. But there is also that lift and shift motion continually happening, right? I'm going to take something that is running on a physical or virtual machine in the data center, and I'm going to plop it on a virtual machine in the cloud. Still aligns with cloud first, not necessarily cloud native, but absolutely organizations just continuing to put trust and faith in the performance, the security, the availability, the cost effectiveness of the cloud. Again, whether that is for existing applications, workload services, or net new to the business.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right, let's double click into that. So you've mentioned a few times, I mentioned it earlier, the idea of new workloads. Where are new workloads coming from? So to answer that, now this is from the data protection trends. Let's actually get into the new data, right? The fun data that you rely on. And the first part there is when organizations were asked. So this case, by the way, 1,700 organizations, all unbiased IT leaders, IT implementers, are part of that cloud protection trends report. And we'll make sure to get the URL so you can download that report. It's VEE.am, Veeam, /CPT, Cloud Protection Trends 23, as the URL, Veeam /CPT 23. So in that report of the 1,700, we see here about 1,200, almost 1,300-ish were responsible for IaaS as part of their strategy. Now let's take a look at this for a second. Now this is the second year we've done this. We asked this in 2021 as well. And I think it's interesting, Sam, it's nearly even thirds, right? About a third of the workloads that spun up in the cloud last year, a third of them came from physical servers, right? So that is you take it into an image, you go through a migration utility or a third-party backup like what Veeam does, and you pull that over. A third of the bottom come from VMs, and that's actually much easier, right? That's where lift and shift can be very, very straightforward. And then, as we talked about before, for many organizations that are cloud first, it's the created new. This didn't come from the data center. Only 70% come from the data center. The rest are coming up straight as, I need a new server. Why wouldn't it be cloudy? Is that fair from this perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair. Again, these transformative strategies, just how digital this world that we're living is becoming, is just forcing organizations to create a myriad of new application services workloads. And again, why not do that in the cloud? I don't have to go out and procure, wait for it to be delivered, install, manage, maintain, upgrade. It is just there. It is just as easy as input my credit card details into an account, click launch a VM, and poof, there it is, and it's exactly the specs that I needed. So I think that is why the cloud, or one of the reasons why the cloud has become this de facto standard, even for things just like running a VM versus being truly cloud native. But again, just as infrastructure starts to age and become decommissioned, instead of going through that large capital expenditure of upgrading everything, it is equally as easy or somewhat easier to just migrate that to the cloud.
Yeah, speaking of decommissioning, I think this is the reason that when Dave and I first looked at the slide, it kind of reaffirmed for us that as organizations embrace cloud first, it's not necessarily defining the demise or the death of the data center, but it is defining the dilution of that. Because as you mentioned, 30% of the workloads here are coming up net new. Well, we know that organizations are not decommissioning data center workloads at 30% year over year, right? We know that, right? So workloads are still hanging on in the data center, but the new stuff in orange is coming online faster than the old stuff is rolling off the back of the truck. And the net result is it dilutes the portion of the data center that's there. Now, and I know we're going to talk more about backup as with Leah next week, someone from your team as well. But admittedly, that does kind of change the model, because if the only thing you're thinking about backing up is the stuff that's running on premises, that's going to be a minority of your production IT platforms. If not 2023, certainly by 2024, that's got to be something that you're focused on.
Yeah, 100%. I think we look at backup tooling, let's just say, and how it's evolved over the years, going from physical to virtual, which really led to the pioneering of Veeam, right? An agentless image-based backup for virtual machines, because the best way to protect a workload or a machine is native to that specific platform. And the same goes for the public cloud, right? So the way that yes, there's data protection required for on-premises, but there's absolutely data protection required in the cloud. Can you take a one-size-fits-all approach? Yes. Is it going to be the most optimized from an efficiency and a resource and a cost perspective? No. But it might just get you there, especially infrastructure as a service, not necessarily platform. So it really requires the utilization of dedicated purpose-built tools to protect these cloud workloads that can take advantage of native security, native storage, native snapshots, again, in order to give you that best-in-class purpose-built data protection.
Now, of course, one thing that I'm always keen on is, just because you're using tools that are optimized per workload does not necessarily mean that you want to bifurcate or vary the types of vendors that are used. So that's one of the reasons why I certainly want to make sure single vendor, just use the right tool. It's like one bag of golf clubs. There's a difference that irons are different than woods. All right, now, the other side of this question, though, is we first looked at, okay, so, where do cloud workloads first come from? We saw that. But I think it's important for organizations to realize, according to the data, that just because something went from the data center to the cloud does not mean it won't ever go back again, right? So, in fact, that was the other half of the question was, has your organization ever brought workloads back from the public cloud back to on-premises? Now, you'll notice here in the orange wedge, we see 12% have said no. The inverse of 12 is 88% have therefore said yes. 88% of organizations have brought workloads back on-prem once they've been to the cloud. Now, a couple things that are interesting about this. We did actually cut this by region. And in fact, in the Americas, where Sam and I are, 99% of organizations said they have brought workloads back again. But I think it's interesting, Sam, when you look on this list, there's a couple different reasons why. And in fact, these add up to more than 88, because evidently most organizations chose at least two of these three paths along the way. So, looking right to left, I liked the idea that some folks, like developers, would have wrote an application in their favorite public cloud, but perhaps for sovereignty or control or access to a manufacturing line, whatever it is, it was always intended that you would bring it back on-prem later when it was actually going to run in production. I do think it's interesting. About 43% of organizations said, hey, I'm going to call this cloud remorse. Right, I put it up there and maybe the performance wasn't right, or they figured out the cloud is not free. Turns out it costs money if you're going to run stuff up there. And then lastly, I am, of course, a big fan of, hey, my data center is on fire, underwater, caught crispy, whatever that happens to be. I failed over to the cloud for DR purposes. Once I rebuilt my data center, I brought everything back again, or at least a good portion of it. I love the idea of this. One of the things which is actually not on this list is the concept of bringing data from one cloud to another. And I know that's an area that's passionate for you as well, especially because we're good citizens with multiple clouds. React to this data, and then let's really kind of double click into that. I think you're calling it cloud freedom. I'm going to call it hybriditous fluidity. We can figure out another term from there. But what do you see on this chart, and what do you hear from customers?
Firstly, I'm not even going to try and repeat what you said because I'll go and embarrass myself. I'm not even necessarily going to go left to right. I think that the borderline line during a disaster and then back on premises, I think that we kind of expected that one. We understand that a failover is a temporary thing until we can get our data center back up and in great working shape and bring everything back. But the other two certainly are more interesting. And I think that you hit perfectly on the reasons why someone would either plan to run something in the data center, even though they build it in the cloud, or the cloud remorse or over rotation towards the cloud. And it really kind of hits on performance expectations. The closer that we're bound by physics, right? The closer that you are to the data, ultimately the better the performance is going to be. There's only so much that you can transmit over the internet. The other piece is around like governance. I think we do have a lot better oversight in terms of what is being created on premises. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but certainly in the cloud, shadow IT is real. I mentioned the ease of like username, password, couple of personal attributes, credit card, and all of a sudden I've got an account that I can deploy any one of hundreds of different services, and my organization might not even know that that's going on. So that's certainly a problem, and then but a benefit of the data center, because I do want to talk about, yes, the benefits of the cloud, but also data center and why it leads to this hybriditous fluidity. I think that's what you called it. And the other piece is sovereignty,
Nice job.
right?
Yeah.
We look at things like GDPR, where can data live, how long must it live for? The reality is not each and every single cloud vendor has a data center within the confines of a country border, right? So I think that that's why we'll always have this hybrid or multi-cloud, because each platform, each infrastructure has its own benefits, it has its own drawbacks, and it's just really aligning the workloads best to the benefits versus the drawbacks. And that's might be why we see some of the over rotation. Like in the cloud, I pay for every ounce of compute, storage, networking, API calls. And I didn't necessarily think about that when I moved it there. And then I got my first bill and I'm like, well, I'm going to get that back out as quick as I can.
So I've been in IT for 32 years, and I remember when I first started, when a department said they had a workload they wanted to spin up, it's like, oh, no problem. Let's talk about the performance, and I will go buy you that server, and I will install that OS, and I'll install that app, and in about 6 weeks, you can start to do work. Fast forward 15 years, and I would be walking through the marketing team's office or the sales team office, and I would notice there's a larger than normal desktop sitting underneath somebody's desk, and they were running VMware, and they were running their own little servers. And the problem was that if we didn't know about it, it wasn't getting backed up, right? It wasn't managed, it wasn't patched, it wasn't, all those other things that real IT does that shadow IT does not. And you'd catch them and you'd say you can't do that, and then you'd start protecting those workloads, et cetera, from there. And you bring up a really good point that I hadn't thought about on this is, those organizations that now there's no box with blinky lights sitting underneath somebody's desk. They just went out and spun it up. I think when we do this survey question next year, we're going to add another box on here where it says, did you move stuff back? And the answer will be because, yes, I got caught doing shadow IT. And we'll go from there. So way to value add for the Cloud Trends Report for 24. All right. So, now you and I both talked about this concept of lift and shift, right? The idea of, okay, so it used to be a physical server, it used to be a VM, and now I'm just going to bring it the same that it was. So if Windows is still Windows and Linux is still Linux, I'm just going to pick it up and I'm going to go put it on what's essentially cloudy metal, right? And I'm fine with that, right? You can run databases inside of Windows instances. You can run file shares inside of Windows or Linux instances. I'm good for that. And yet, for a lot of organizations, that's not going to be the nirvana scenario where they're wholly embracing the agility that cloud can provide. So let's take a look at that for a second. And in this case, going back to that cloud protection trends data, this is one of the few questions where we really kind of want to understand, is it Amazon centric, Azure centric? And turns out it's not. So the adoption trends are pretty similar between the two juggernaut hyperscale clouds. At least in this part of the world. So I have the same data for structured data for databases in just a second, but let's look at file for a second, where on the left-hand side we see, are you running file shares? That are hosted on Amazon and then on Azure on the right. I think it's interesting that we got 66 on the left versus 60 on the right, looking at those top ones. So the server instance, that's lift and shift. And yet on the next bands down in the light blue, we see file shares running natively. So that's Amazon file shares, that's Azure file share, Azure file sync. You could kind of squint your eyes a little bit and also put OneDrive for Business in there as well. But that idea of just having native file shares being offered out, I love the fact they're surprisingly close. That seems like a lot of organizations really are moving past just lift and shift towards native platform. Does that surprise you?
I think when I initially saw this data, I felt surprised that the incidence of lift and shift was so high, right? When we know that's dedicated platform as a service that can do pretty much any flavor of database that you want across these platforms, yet folks still are choosing to run it on a virtual machine within that cloud versus just going dedicated PaaS. But then as I looked at the data that you had on the previous slide, especially around lift and shift, those numbers made a lot more sense. And then I just started trying to think of reasons why that might be the case. I think familiarity is probably one of them. Cost is likely another. It can be somewhat costly to run platform as a service, particularly as you transition more responsibility to that cloud provider. And then, just other small reasons as well. Like maybe they already have a license for SQL Server, and it's not just ready to give it up yet. So it was.
So I'll give you one more because I was talking with a large reseller in the Pac West, and got a chance to preview some of this data with them. And one of the things that they talked about was when you're the challenge of refactoring an application when it's a multi-server instance, right? So like, if you have a complex traditional database, some folks would call it mode 2, where you've got some front-end web servers and you've got some middle layer and you got a couple back-end databases, and oh, by the way, you need some Active Directory to authenticate all of it. So, right, you've got 4 different server instances that all make up this app. Right, and that all works really great when it was in the data center. If you lift and shift all 4 of those types of VMs and put them in the cloud, it probably works just as fine there. When you start saying, hey, I'm going to go ahead and pull the database layer out, or I'm going to go ahead and pull the file shares out of that multi-tiered stack and now run that, it requires that you refactor how all the other components within that stack are going to interact with each other. And so for some folks, that was actually the biggest challenge. And I think that's probably going to be one of the reasons why some apps will never go to PaaS database or never go to just unstructured file in their own right, because it's part of stacks, and stacks are easier to manage when all the containers are the same thing. It's like 4 Tupperwares. You don't have 3 Tupperwares in a cardboard box. You're gonna miss something. So
yeah, I mean, you're moving from, like you say, your traditional 3-tiered, 4-tiered application that is very tightly coupled, and now you're moving to a truly cloud native way of thinking where everything is loosely coupled, and we try and utilize microservices and serverless. And really reduce our number of virtual machines and start to employ things like functions as a service, or Azure Functions, or AWS Lambda executing some Python scripts, and the reference data is there in the database, in the file share, and increasingly actually in object storage as well, as that becomes more performant and capable of powering these applications. But yeah, there absolutely is a big learning curve in going from, again, tightly coupled, loosely coupled, monolithic, cloud native. And it's a big jump, and it's a big professional services opportunity as well.
That you bring up another good point, and that is that for most organizations, just the ability of doing lift and shift. If you are already comfortable with virtualization and a little bit of networking that goes along with it, and if you happen to have an IaaS admin who has set you up in a cloudy sandbox that's relatively safe and secure already, lifting and shifting VMs, you can use that same admin and just teach them a couple new skills. Go get your Azure Foundation certificate. Go get your basic AWS EC2, and all of a sudden you're now a cloud admin, right? That's going to look a little different if you say, hey, I'm going to go take a database guy and turn them into something which is running native. And that's actually going to cue me up for my last point. Before I go there, though, and I apologize, the coloring is wrong on the left, but take a look at the coloring on the right, because we've got, parallel. The lime greens are server instance lift and shift. The bluish greens are running native. But take a look at the oranges and reds colored correctly on that right-hand side. I think it's really interesting. Only 3% of the 17 or the 1,000 respondents on this particular question said they had no interest in running file shares from a cloud, right? Only 4% said they're not doing it, but they are interested. And another 2% said they're not yet in production, but they're working on it right now. I mean, collectively, we got 7-9% ish. I mean, it's barely double digits, single digits ish. This seems like this is inevitable for organizations of almost every size.
Yeah, I agree. The cloud is here now. I think that there were, again, a number of hesitations in terms of moving towards the cloud, especially from a security angle. Folks were not comfortable with it.
Right.
But that has, as the cloud has evolved, I think people are becoming more and more confident with the security of the cloud, sometimes forced because of COVID and what we were talking
Sure.
about earlier. But really the same principles apply as you do on premises. There's just different ways of going out and achieving it, right? We still want to do things like least privilege access permissions. And you can achieve that with IAM and Azure Active Directory and Google IAM. You've got things like, instead of physical separation in the data center, how do you go and achieve that in the cloud? Well, you can utilize logical separation, understanding, where these cloud providers draw security boundaries, things like accounts and subscriptions and projects. So
Yeah.
I think that folks are just becoming much, much more confident and comfortable with the cloud now that it is truly a mainstay. And that has pretty much eradicated all fears, let's say, down to our single digit numbers.
Most of the rational fears. There's probably a few folks that you'll still just have, a religious problem, not a logical one. Hey, we're going to finish on this last slide, and it's basically going to say the same thing, right? So in databases, you see again single-digit non-interest in the reds and the oranges down below, and again you're seeing lift and shift somewhere in that 60 plus. Let's call it 3 out of 5 organizations ish. That are running server instances that happen to have databases within those server instances. Those are the lime greens on top. You do see a couple different shades of blues and greens in that middle where we're doing managed databases. Poster child on the left being Amazon RDS. Poster child on the right being Azure Managed Database Services. I will, by the way, point out that when you download the full Cloud Protection Trends report for 2023, we actually did double click into these and ask the respondents, what databases are you running in those server instances, and which databases are you running in Amazon RDS as an example. Spoiler alert, by the way, on Azure managed database, Azure SQL, kind of the main kid there. No surprises there. Same thing, by the way, when you look on the file one, you'll be able to see whether it's Windows file shares, whether it's Linux file shares, NetApp, ONTAP via cloud. Lots of options from that. So I just kind of want to wrap up for today. We've set the groundwork, right? So we're seeing that slight dilution in physical. We've seen virtualization being relatively a mainstay, but all the new stuff is going cloud first. I'm going to give you the last word. We're almost at time. What does this mean for data protection strategy with workloads modernly moving to clouds, but in between clouds and sometimes back again?
I think that these organizations absolutely need hybriditous fluidity, Jason. I'm going to get that down. It's going to be in my dreams. We touched on data protection earlier and the necessity for purpose-built tooling for each and every single one of these different environments. And you brought up a really good point, which is we're not advocating for using multiple different point products from multiple different vendors that all have different learning curves and capabilities and feature disparities and licensing schemas, and none of them talk to one another and they lock your data into that platform. Jason and I aren't advocating for that. We're kind of advocating for a have your cake and eat it as well scenario, whereby you can utilize best of breed, purpose built native tooling for each and every single platform, but they are all kind of under one umbrella. They all talk to one another, and they enable this fluidity between a hybrid and multi-cloud data center. So as you or sorry, infrastructure. So, as your organization is in this transformative stage and we want to move a physical machine or a virtual machine to the cloud, data protection doesn't become a hurdle that you have to overcome. You don't have to go out and procure a new license, learn a new piece of software, implement it, manage it. You ultimately have a platform that can be as flexible and agile as you need it to be, and backup is no longer, again, a hindrance to moving from one type of technology to another. And that same goes within the cloud as well, right? Okay, well, today I want to move this database from a VM on-prem and run it as a VM in the cloud. And then in 12 months' time, I'm going to refactor this to run truly cloud native. Again, you don't want data protection to hinder that. And you're just going to want something that's going to move with that strategy.
Love that, love that. And that's going to set us up actually for next week. So as I said, our friend Leah, actually a Microsoft Azure alum, now at Veeam, is going to be talking with us around the backup roles and methods for protecting this landscape. If you haven't seen it already, go check out the blog that Sam and I wrote. And we will see you next Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel. Sam, thanks for joining us. And for everyone else, thanks for watching.
Thanks very much, Jason. Thanks, everyone.